Okay, Alexander, we have another row, another dispute between France and the UK, Macron and Johnson. And this was actually something that I thought was settled, which has to do with the fisheries and between the EU and the UK, France and the UK. And I thought this was already a done deal. This was one of the major talking points during the final days of the Brexit negotiation. But it's not. It hasn't been resolved, has it? And we still have an argument between France and the UK. And if it's an argument between France and the UK, that means it's essentially an argument between the EU and the UK. What is going on here?
Well, this is a very complex dispute, but you're absolutely right to say that we all assumed it was settled in the run-up to the final Brexit agreement, which was largely negotiated, by the way. People don't like to mention the fact between Johnson and Macron. If you take your mind back to the events just before the Brexit deal was done, if you go back to 2019, there was that long Brexit war. Theresa May was resisting implementing, a really hard Brexit, and she had this extraordinary programme which would have basically kept Britain locked into the European single market and therefore subject to European law. Anyway, Johnson then came in. He didn't have a majority in Parliament. His political position looked extremely weak. And what then happened was he met Macron at the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York, and the two of them together cut a deal. And that deal then became, in effect, the new withdrawal agreement, which paved the way for Brexit on actually much more favourable terms to Britain than Theresa May's Brexit was, but leaving all sorts of issues unresolved. Now, you're quite right. We didn't think at the time that fisheries was one of those issues. Fisheries seemed to be, in fact, an issue in which Johnson had given ground to Macron on, because what was happening was that the British left the EU. They were able to claim back large parts of their seas that they'd previously been exclusive for the British fishing fleet, which, by the way, is much reduced in size. But they agreed to license European fishing boats to actually continue to fish in these waters. And what has happened now is that Macron is loudly complaining that they're not licensing as many of those fishing boats as they should be because of all sorts of complicated reasons that I'm not going to waste time going into. But anyway, this is becoming an escalating row, and it's becoming a row that's now becoming very personal. So whereas Johnson and Macron had previously worked together, they now seem to be absolute enemies and deeply hostile to each other. And of course, what started as a dispute over fisheries is now expanding into a dispute about everything. So Macron is insisting that the EU take the hardest possible line, for example, on the issue of Northern Ireland and the renegotiation of the Northern Irish Protocol, which the British are very sensitive about. His Prime Minister has written an extraordinary letter to the European Commission, which says that the British need to be punished for going along with Brexit. And the impression in London is that Macron is now running in the French election as an anti-British candidate, a candidate who's hostile to Britain, hostile to the United States, to the Anglo-Saxons, and who's interested in winning the election on a tidal wave of an Anglophobia, of which, by the way, there has always been an element in France. And this, of course, has been exacerbated by the AUKUS deal, the deal where the French were cut out, and the British and the Americans cut out the French and sold nuclear technology for the Australians to build nuclear submarines, and that's added to this sense of anger. But the effect is that it's driving Britain away from Europe at a much faster pace than anybody expected, because it means that negotiations between Britain and Europe and the EU in general to sort of try and come to some arrangements for a post-Brexit future are absolutely stuck, because the EU backs the French because France is an EU country, and the French are taking the hardest possible line against the British and are looking for ways to pick fights with them on practically everything.
Yeah, but why does Boris put up with it? Why does the UK put up with it? I mean, they're out of the EU, supposedly. They're out of the EU. And what leverage does the EU have over Boris Johnson at this
Right.
moment in time? I mean, is it that does he not want to lose the trading partner in the EU and certain other things which aren't related to the fisheries? Is that why he plays along with
Right.
this, or is he trying to honor an agreement or a contract? I mean, why does he put up with this type of abuse? It seems.
It's interesting because, in fact, my impression is that over the last couple of weeks, Johnson has hit his stride again. He went through a very wobbly spring and summer, but he seems much more confident over the last couple of weeks. He had a very successful party conference, Conservative Party conference. He seems to have put Sunak, who is his chief political rival within the Conservative Party, he seems to contain the threat from Sunak. And my impression is that he's been gradually edging towards taking a harder line with the French. And that means eventually, I think, moving towards that hard Brexit, which is really the only way forward. I mean, I've always said this, if you're going to Brexit at all, then that kind of clean break was always the only logical way in which to do it. If you try and sort of stay in some way, but not in others, you'd either be drawn back in or you'd be put in a position where you'd have endless rows and quarrels of the sort that we're having. So a hard Brexit, complete clean break, move forward in the future, negotiate on equal terms whatever suits you and whatever suits them, and then you're moving forward coherently. But that was not the Brexit deal that Johnson initially negotiated, and it's proved difficult for him to extricate himself from it. And he's not, I think, ultimately to blame for that. His predecessor, Theresa May, was, because she made all kinds of commitments to the Europeans, which to a certain extent Johnson himself was bound by. But anyway, that's history. Now, why is he not moving even more purposefully towards that hard Brexit, which is, in my opinion, the only, as I said, logical Brexit? The short answer is because he does not lead a fully united government, and the political class remains consistently opposed to any move towards any kind of Brexit at all. If you spend your time here in Britain and you read the influential newspapers and you listen to the BBC, if you read The Guardian, the Financial Times, and, as I said, listen to the BBC, what you will get from that is that the fault for the economic problems that Britain is experiencing at the moment, which are the same economic problems as are being experienced by everybody everywhere, that the fault for that is Brexit, that the reason that things are so bad is because Brexit was implemented and that it was a huge mistake, and that the thing we need to do is to try to come to some kind of terms, and that the reason that there is this quarrel with the French is because Johnson is some kind of populist nationalist who always picks fights, when in reality, as I said, it is Macron who, for political reasons, is picking the fights at the moment. Now, that does constrain what Johnson is able to do, because he always has to fight back against this very strong, persisting Remainer sentiment within the British establishment. But at the same time, he has to take into account the fact that it also prevails amongst much of the Conservative Party, within the business community, and at some levels of the cabinet also. And given that his position, Johnson's position, has not always been secure or stable, I think he feels that he has to edge towards it sideways rather than march towards it straightforwardly and go for it in that kind of a way. So I think that's really what that probably explains why we're seeing this happen in the way that it is. But I expect that we will have, at some point in 2022, an effective no-deal Brexit situation.
Do you think that's the right approach for Macron? Do you think he's handling this in the right way? It sounds like Boris may actually be handling it in the right way. Do you think Macron is handling this with skill, or is this just emotional for him, or about winning an election?
I think it is partly emotional for him. I think it's also about winning an election. But if we go back to some of those discussions we had on the Duran back in 2019, always remember this about Macron. Macron is the EU's ultra-integrationist. He is the person who wants to convert the EU into a superstate. And the people who historically were acting as the obstacle within the EU to creating the superstate were the British. So for that reason, Macron always wanted the British out. And not just out, he wanted them totally out. He wanted their influence within the EU completely dissipated so that he could go ahead with his grand superstate ideas, setting up the army, having the tax system, having the elected president, all those kind of things. It would, of course, be Macron himself. That was always his objective. So, yes, it's emotional. He clearly feels very angry with Johnson. I suspect that the nuclear deal, the nuclear submarine deal with Australia, plays a big role in all of this. So, clearly he feels angry about that. Clearly he also senses that this plays well in France. It rallies patriotic opinion to some extent behind him, weakening his right-wing rivals, Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen. And of course, lastly, it is coherent with his long-term philosophy and political views. Getting the British out is his way to move his European project forward. The risk he runs is that, of course, stirring up patriotic sentiments in this way actually ultimately strengthens the right, perhaps Eric Zemmour at the moment more than Marine Le Pen, at which point, of course, he might find that the French trust Zemmour to defend their interests against the British and others more than they trust Macron. They'd be right about that, by the way. That might, instead of succeeding for him in the election in April, that might work out badly for him in April. But at the moment, it's playing out to his advantage.
All right, we'll continue to follow this story, which is interesting to see it spring up again. Because as we said in the first segment, Alexander, I thought this was a done deal, but I guess not.
No.
It never is with the EU.
No, never.
That's for sure.
Well, that's why you either go or stay. There's no in between. It's a fundamental mistake to think there is.
I agree with that. When you're dealing with the EU, you're either out or you're in. Period.
Exactly.
When you're in, it's hell. When you're out, the UK will be just fine. All right, we'll leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com and go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code Real News.